Kingdom Come Deliverance 2 is a game at launch that is in many ways different from its peers, feeling old school in all the best ways. Like games in the past, which arrived polished at launch, KCD2 bucks the trend of the 2020s, where even the largest games from huge franchises can launch in technically atrocious states on PC, and sometimes are even left in a broken state forever. So in today's video on Digital Foundry, I want to take a break from my usual hair pulling and whinging to just praise a well-made game on PC. It's not perfect in all ways, as I will describe later, but it is a game that the developers should be proud of, and one that is a beacon in these trying times filled with technical skullduggery. Now, perhaps one of the reasons why KCD2 is in such a great state is because it has a unique starting point in its engine choice, CryEngine. This Crysis-derived technology powered the last Kingdom Come game in 2018, and it is back here for the second outing, this time in DirectX 12 form. And unlike so many other DirectX 12 games, Kingdom Come Deliverance 2 is not filled with stutters, hitches, or otherwise troublesome frame times constantly, which we have all too often come to expect in modern PC releases. For this video, I eschewed playing on a high-end PC and instead spent most of my gameplay time on a rather low-end one, a Ryzen 5 3600 with an RTX 4060. That's an aged CPU and a GPU with a truncated PCIe bus, and still, frame times were not an issue when targeting 60 FPS. Even though the game does not have a visible shader pre-compilation step, seeing new effects and new things didn't trigger frame time hitches. After playing the game for a good number of hours, I can say I did not experience obvious shader compilation stutter when something new showed up on screen. Based upon what I know from my interviews with Crytek, loading screens between chapters here may be doing some PSO pre-caching, and PSO pre-caching could be happening in the background while playing the game in an asynchronous manner that uses less burdened CPU threads to precompile those shaders. Either way, the result is what speaks, and even on a low-end CPU like the Ryzen 5 3600, it was not something that I found to be there in an obvious way. I find this very refreshing, as many games that even have long shader pre-compilation steps still often fail to do the job exhaustively, leading to awkward and obvious stutter which mars the first play experience, and then returns again each time the game is updated or your drivers are updated. A game only has one chance to make a first impression, and doing it wrong is just simply bad form. KCD2 is much more polished in this regard than many other titles I review on PC for DF. In all my hours of play on the Ryzen 5 3600, I only found 2 instances in total of frame time spikes, which broke the 60 FPS cap in normal gameplay, and both of them curiously happened in the prologue. One right here while moving forward in the pond, and another later on in the prologue while moving from the stream to Bojana's house. I'm not sure what they were, but they were the only time I saw frame time issues in my almost 8 hours of play on this low-end CPU. As you can guess then, probably, my saying that means I did not record any instances of traversal stutter issues or likewise, or big issues with frame times when encountering areas with many NPCs. Running through the game world and through areas of varying density did nothing to dent the frame time graph or frame rate graph for that matter on the Ryzen 5 3600. And even when hitting the NPC and object dense area of Kuttenberg, the 3600 here produced a perfectly flat frame time graph with zero issues, and the smoothness was impeccable. Yes, I am running the game here at medium settings, which will reduce the draw distance of objects and grass and more, but still the game has things like real-time software ray-traced GI active at medium. So this is no small feat of performance. And importantly, me showing this performance on screen here shows that the Ryzen 5 3600 can play the game's base gameplay design with all the dense open world quests, NPC schedules, and AI, and bigger population densities, and not be terribly CPU limited in a way which produces bad frame times. This is definitely not the norm in high production value releases. Take something like Dragon's Dogma 2. Even there, at the medium settings with the ray tracing off, just running through that game city produces extremely poor frame times, exceeding 33 milliseconds constantly, and with an average frame rate somewhere in the 40s, with dips into the 30s at its worst. This is all while having NPCs appear out of thin air next to your character. Or take Avowed, which I recently reviewed. And even at that game's lowest settings, which is graphically inferior to KCD2, I would say, we are still seeing big frame time stutters when crossing the terrain there, and extremely poor performance in the 40s at worst when you get closer to NPC settlements. I'm actually in awe of how well KCD2 runs in areas of greater density with more NPCs, especially if you look at its peers that I just mentioned in the genre of open world fantasy or historical RPGs. KCD2 here is an extreme outlier. Good frame times for the basic gameplay systems where so many other games cannot manage that at all. It is doubly impressive too, in my opinion, as KCD2 is a lot smoother and CPU friendly than its predecessor, KCD1, which came out in 2018. That, even though this game is much more ambitious graphically and in terms of detail. In KCD1, moving through Ratai for the first time, I was able to measure and see big frame time spikes even at the medium settings there. All the while, there are far less NPCs and the graphical quality is noticeably worse than the second game. So Warhorse Studio here has improved the quality of their tech over time, and it is a much smoother game than the first one. This improvement and this base level of frame time smoothness that we see in KCD2 should be the thing that every game strives for. But since it is so rare nowadays, I think it deserves only the highest praise that I can give from Digital Foundry. So bravo Warhorse, audentes fortuna juvat!
Audentes fortuna juvat!
What's that you keep yelling, Sir Hans?
Along with running quite well, KCD2 manages to do a number of things graphically that I think stand out. The core look of the game is heavily influenced by the technology powering the indirect lighting, and here the game utilizes one of the more advanced modes of CryEngine's sparse voxel octree global illumination, also known as SFOGI. As we can see here, the 3D geometry is simplified into blocky voxels of increasing coarseness at a distance. In the debug view, red bricks are smaller, greener are larger, and blue in the distance are the largest. These voxels then are cone traced against in software to give the game real-time diffuse global illumination. Like games with hardware ray tracing, this gives the game a realistic color palette on a coarser scale where you see light acting a lot more like it would in real life. So big structures such as these stairs in the wall here have realistic natural occlusion from the skylighting, darkening them towards the interior. Or this castle courtyard here where the sun is out of reach is purely lit by the sky with all the overhangs and inlays showing dark indirect shadows. This gives it a realistic look. SFOGI also simulates light bounce with the highest experimental setting in-game, using 2 real light bounces before seemingly falling back to a light cache. You can see this well in the village square here, where underneath the thatch roof, we can see it picking up yellow bounce light from the sun hitting the light tan ground nearby. Or here in this gallery in Kuttenberg, where the sunlight from the left bounces around the archways in it, brightening up the shadows and adjacent walls. Just like other ray-traced GI solutions, you can also see obvious color transfer, perhaps best seen here again in the city, where the sunlight hitting the light red building on the right is splashing a pinkish bounce light on the city wall on the left. Outside the cities, SFOGI combines with very naturalistic and minimal post-processing like found in the original Crysis, and this produces some of the most compelling landscapes I've seen in gaming. The density, variety, and lighter hues of the game's foliage play extremely well with the game's indirect lighting solution. I truly think that these are some of the best looking Central European forested areas and rolling hills that I have seen in gaming to date. It's something about those hues and the natural encroaching darkness caused by denser areas of underbrush. It's all so very compelling to me. It helps, of course, too, that there are a lot of artistic flourishes in there that really help, like the way the streams and brooks crisscross the entire area, or the way the game team actually allows dusk and night to become extremely dark. Have you ever walked along the edge of a forest at dusk and shudder at how impenetrably dark it looks? Yeah, this game models that quite well. In total, the combination of vegetation and natural lighting gives this game an impeccable ambiance in its more rural areas, and you need to experience it firsthand, I think. Often I found myself just wandering around, engaging in incidental virtual tourism, inspecting that landscape and appreciating how light bounces around it on its larger scale. So the game can look pretty great while running really well. But as I hinted at the beginning of this video, a number of visual aspects in KCD2 do not scale as high as in other games. Beyond purely graphical things, there are a few legacy CryEngine idiosyncrasies that Warhorse has left in here that noticeably degrade the quality of the game's graphics. Like back in Crysis 3 in 2013, the plant physics and animations for plants found in the game run at a lower frame rate than the rest of the world. So if you're at 60 FPS, they'll run at 30, but with improper animation pacing, so they update at uneven intervals. As you can see here looking at these plants on the ground, I think they look framey and awkward. Here I would really love an ultra high-end setting for plants to make their movement one-to-one with the real produced frame rate. Same with water interactions. This has been an issue in the engine since Crysis 2, and just like that game from 2011, water interaction only occurs at 30 FPS here, giving the water a framey look at times when things move around in it. Once again, I would love to have a higher quality option here where the frame rate of water is higher. The most glaring thing to run at 30 FPS in KCD2 though are the cutscenes, which you will see when you lock the FPS down. So per default, if you play the game at 60 FPS, the real-time cutscenes run at half of that at 30. I can only guess as to why Warhorse chose to do this, but I imagine that they did so for consistency reasons with the game's numerous pre-rendered cutscenes, which are used to mask loading in the game's intro. Real-time cutscenes occur back-to-back with these often, and they are technically more visually consistent with them when they are locked to 30. I don't think it's always a great fit though. For one, the pre-rendered cutscenes tend to have frame pacing issues with bursts of uneven frame times, which in playback makes it look like the videos are dropping frames. This can also occasionally occur with real-time cutscenes that are using the default frame lock. They can have frame pacing issues. Here I wish Warhorse added an in-game option in the menu that would separately control the cutscene frame rate. By modding the game's pack files, as you can find online, you can unlock cutscene frame rates as you can see here, and side by side it's easy to notice that they run perfectly fine at arbitrary frame rates above 30. They look excellent at higher FPS. This is even true on low-end hardware like the Ryzen 5 3600 and RTX 4060, so it is eminently doable, and I hope Warhorse allows us to toggle this in-game in the future. Related to this, one thing I want to mention is that the game has some issues when downsampling or upsampling. Basically, if your game or desktop resolution is set differently than the display's native resolution, the game's frame rate cap breaks a bit. As you can see here, the desktop is set to 1080p, but the display has a max active signal of 4K. When this is the case, frame capping halves the frame rate. So using a 60 FPS cap in-game makes the game actually run at 30. Hopefully the devs can look at that. Getting over to graphical quality in and of itself, I think it's easy at times to see the areas where Kingdom Come Deliverance 2 does not scale as high as it potentially could. The most obvious area is in reflections and lighting precision. For reflections specifically, the game seems to leverage cube maps and screen space reflections, as foggy here in this title only applies to diffuse lighting, even though technically there is a version of it that applies to specular lighting in CryEngine. As a result, sometimes things like metal or water can look out of place, either glowing strangely in comparison to the surrounding darkness or just poorly shaded, while the rougher surfaces nearby look a lot more natural. Due to the reliance on cube maps for specularity, the game can sometimes just look overly diffuse, with reflections missing on surfaces where you really should expect them. Yes, The Middle Ages were dirty times, potentially, but I think the roughness of the world here also comes down to an incomplete lighting model. The lack of scaling in the reflections is perhaps most obvious around bodies of water, where screen space reflections cause many artifacts. They have obvious disocclusion issues, they disappear around screen edges, and also when the camera moves up and down. The cube maps underneath them tend to only be rough approximations of the world. Since specular reflections are a weak point in this game's visuals, it would be nice to have an optional ray traced reflections options, which would do wonders for things such as bodies of water and armor. Technically, CryEngine does support ray traced reflections, as we've seen it in the remastered Crysis games. But maybe that was just a one-off thing, and perhaps Warhorse would have to roll their own tech here. As I mentioned earlier, lighting precision is another issue here. Sfogy is good, but it only really works for big occlusions and rolling hills. It's not fine-grained enough for smaller things. This is important in this game as you're playing it in the first person, and you can get pretty close to objects. It is quite common to be inside some building, stall, or barn or whatever, and you'll see light leaking from the outside through the wall on the inside. Likewise, smaller dynamic objects do not work with Sfogy and are only handled by SSAO, so you will often find many small objects in the game floating and disassociated from the overall lighting. SSAO can only do so much there. Voxel tracing is of course a limited technology, but one can for sure dream how amazing this game could look with a more fine-grained per pixel GI solution, or even path tracing. But that's just me dreaming. Who knows what future patches to this game will bring. Another thing that I want to mention is related to lighting, and that is how the game is presented on a screen. At the moment, there is no HDR support. Just looking at the game's visuals though, I think it's obvious that HDR support would be killer. So let's hope the team can add that down the line. The last comment I have on graphical quality is about the naming conventions of the graphical options themselves. Now honestly, beyond some CPU scaling things I will mention a bit later, I do not think this game requires much tweaking from Ultra, but reading the positive discourse online surrounding this game, I see many people surprised at how well this game runs at Ultra settings. As many longtime DF viewers know, a settings name does not actually mean much, as one game's low settings can easily be another game's ultra settings. In the case of KCD2, I often found that anything set lower than ultra or even higher had obvious visual shortcomings throughout the experience. Take for example shadow quality. If you use the medium setting as I did in my playthrough on the mid-spec PC, you can often see shadows looking a bit rough and ugly in NPC conversations during the daytime. To get the shadow maps up to a quality where they do not have more obvious issues, you're going to want to go up to around ultra, as we can see here. Also, if you're using medium or even high, you will see obvious light leak in indoor areas, like under this bridge here. Only going up to ultra really eliminated that in a good way. Same with volumetric quality. If you play the game on the lower settings, like medium here, when walking through the forest, you can see blotchy aliasing occurring in between leaves as the volumetric lighting in the background is too low res and is causing errors. I found that only going up to the experimental setting above ultra got rid of obvious artifacting at this res here in any forest. Or take skin shading. I found that the character skin can have these striated lines on them from shadows at any setting below ultra. Given this behavior for the settings, my basic takeaway from KCD2 is that, excluding draw distance, the graphical settings in this game below ultra scale lower than seen in other titles. And as such, the ultra in this game can be a little bit more like the medium of another game that just doesn't scale as low. Winding down at the end of this video here, I have some optimization tips before I close it out. For lower end GPUs of RTX 4060 caliber or similar, I recommend actually keeping the graphical presentation at the ultra settings and leveraging image reconstruction to adjust your GPU load. At quality mode 1080p for example, you will see a performance that is only a bit worse than the game running at medium settings at native resolution. All the while, your tiny trade-off in image sharpness is far less obvious than the other options that the game provides you with, such as shadow quality and vegetation distance, which are much more obvious in comparison. Basically, utilizing image reconstruction in this game allows you to keep settings high with only very minor downsides. For the CPU side of things, I would say there are more limits here. Remember me showing that run into Gutenberg with a completely flat frame rate graph and frame time graph on the Ryzen 5 3600? That was on medium settings, of course, which lowers draw distance for vegetation, characters, and object LOD. With those draw distance related settings brought up to ultra, the CPU will be much more burdened. But generally, due to this game's level of optimization in streaming and on the CPU side, I would say it still runs incredibly well on the Ryzen 5 3600. The game at ultra settings only manages to have a few drops below 60 FPS at brief moments when running through the world on the Ryzen 5 3600, as it just can't keep up there. Thankfully, those drops that you are seeing here on the frame rate graph are actually just gradual increases in frame times and not frame time spikes. This means that CPU-related stress in this game from increased draw distance does not cause stutters. CPU-limited frame rate dipping in this game actually appears quite fluid looking on a VRR monitor, and that is fantastic. If you have a Ryzen 5000 series CPU or later, ultra settings should give you no problems whatsoever when attempting 60 FPS and higher. The last note is regarding experimental settings, and I think most of them, other than volumetric quality, should be left alone unless you have an ultra high-end PC. They tend to bring their greatest differences while looking at things in the distance where you will see greater draw distance essentially. This can of course be fine if you have a big GPU, but the CPU cost is more extreme. Ultra really is quite awesome on the Ryzen 5 3600 as I just showed, but experimental is not so stellar. The frame time increases from experimental settings are thankfully gradual and no stutters are occurring, but most of the run to Gutenberg is spent in the 50s, and some of the areas of greatest density and longest unobstructed view distance can cause dips even into the 40s briefly. Basically, you will need a much more beefy CPU to use experimental settings should you so wish it. And that is really all I want to say about Kingdom Come Deliverance 2. It is a very polished release that Warhorse Studios should be quite proud of. The game will be getting updates, I imagine, in the future, and I would find it awesome if the devs could maybe use some of those updates to increase graphical qualities in the areas that I highlighted. But even without them doing that, I think most people will just have a blast playing this fun game. Anyway, like, subscribe, ring the bell, help us on Patreon. As always, this is Alex bidding you farewell und auf Wiedersehen.